Richard Blackwell was a man who had everything money could buy, everything except what he wanted most. His 17-year-old son, Andrew, had been paralyzed from the waist down after a skiing accident 2 years ago. The best doctors in the world had told Richard the same thing. The damage to Andrew's spinal cord could not be fixed. Despite his great wealth, Richard felt completely helpless. Richard was the owner of Blackwell Industries, a company that made medical equipment. The business had made him very rich. He lived in a large house outside the city with his son and a small staff who helped take care of Andrew. His wife Linda had died from cancer 5 years ago, leaving Richard to raise their son alone. Before the accident, Andrew had been an active teenager who loved sports and science. Now he spent most of his time in his wheelchair, reading books or working on computer programs. Richard had tried everything to help his son walk again. He had taken Andrew to specialists in Europe, Asia, and South America. He had paid for experimental treatments that cost millions of dollars. Nothing worked. On a rainy Tuesday evening in October, Richard was leaving his downtown office building. He had stayed late to finish some work. It was already dark outside and the rain was coming down hard. Richard pulled up the collar of his expensive coat and headed toward the parking garage where his driver was waiting. He was walking quickly, thinking about the business meeting he had the next day when he nearly tripped over something. Or rather, someone. A small figure was sitting in a doorway trying to stay out of the rain. It was a young woman, maybe 20 years old, with tangled blonde hair. She was wearing several layers of old clothes. A small backpack sat next to her. Most days, Richard would have walked past without looking twice. Homeless people were common in the city, and Richard usually gave money to shelters rather than to people on the street. But something made him stop. Maybe it was the way she looked at him. Not begging, or afraid, but with clear, intelligent eyes. "Spare some change, sir?" the girl asked. Her voice was steady and clear, not what Richard expected. Richard reached for his wallet, planning to give her a $20 bill and continue on his way. "Sir, I can make your son walk again," she said quietly. Richard turned and froze. His blood ran cold. He had never seen this girl before. He had never mentioned his son to her. How could she know about Andrew? "Who are you?" he demanded, suddenly suspicious. Was this some kind of scam? How did this homeless girl know about his son? "My name is Grace," she replied simply, "and I know about Andrew because I can help him." Richard stared at her, trying to understand what was happening. "How do you know my son's name? Are you following me?" His voice was angry now. Rich people like him were often targets for con artists and kidnappers. Grace shook her head. "I'm not following you, Mr. Blackwell. I've been waiting for you. I've been watching your company for weeks. I know you've spent millions trying to help Andrew walk again." Richard took a step back. "This is crazy. I'm calling security." He reached for his phone. "Your son had his accident on February 12th, 2 years ago. It was his first time skiing the expert slope. The doctors told you his T10 and T11 vertebrae were damaged beyond repair." Grace spoke quickly, her words precise and confident. Richard's hand stopped halfway to his pocket. This was information that wasn't in the news. Only family members and Andrew's doctors knew these details. "How do you know this?" he whispered. "I know because I've studied his case. I know because I can help him." Grace stood up slowly. She was shorter than Richard had first thought, maybe 5'4". Despite her dirty clothes, she stood straight, with a dignity that seemed out of place. "Who are you, really?" Richard asked. "I told you, my name is Grace. Until 3 years ago, I was a researcher at Barrett University, working on spinal cord regeneration. Now I live on the streets because powerful people wanted to stop my work." She spoke matter-of-factly, as if this was a normal conversation. "If you're a researcher, why are you homeless? Why approach me like this?" Richard still didn't believe her, but he was curious now. "Because they destroyed my lab and my reputation. Because I need help to continue my work. And because I can give you the one thing all your money hasn't been able to buy. A cure for your son." Grace's eyes never left Richard's face. A gust of cold wind blew rain into the doorway. Grace shivered slightly but didn't complain. Richard made a quick decision. "There's a coffee shop around the corner. Let's talk there where it's warm." If you're lying to me, he left the threat unfinished. I'm not lying, Grace said simply. She picked up her backpack and followed Richard. The coffee shop was nearly empty. Richard chose a table in the corner, far from the few other customers. He ordered a coffee for himself and asked Grace what she wanted. "Hot chocolate and a sandwich, please," she said. When the food came, she ate slowly and carefully, like someone who wasn't sure when she would eat again. "Start talking," Richard said after she had taken a few bites. "And it better be good." Grace wiped her mouth with a napkin. 3 years ago, I discovered a way to regenerate damaged nerve tissue. Not just repair it, actually regrow it. I tested it successfully on lab animals, but when I presented my findings to the university board, they shut down my research. "Why would they do that?" Richard asked. "Because my method uses modified human DNA combined with a technology I invented. They called it unethical. They were afraid." Grace took another bite of her sandwich. "After they closed my lab, I continued working on my own. I tested my method on myself." "On yourself?" Richard couldn't hide his shock. Grace rolled up her sleeve slightly, showing a series of small, precise scars on her arm. "I had nerve damage in my left arm from a childhood accident. I fixed it. I can fix your son too." Richard wanted to dismiss her as crazy, but something about her certainty made him hesitate. "If what you're saying is true, it would be worth billions. Why come to me specifically?" "Because you have the resources I need, because you have a personal reason to help me succeed, and because your company already makes medical equipment that I can modify for my work." Grace finished her hot chocolate. "All I need is a lab, supplies, and protection." "Protection from what?" Richard asked. "From the people who tried to stop me before." For the first time, a flash of fear crossed Grace's face. "They're still looking for me." Richard sat back in his chair. This was either the most elaborate scam he had ever encountered or the miracle he had been praying for. He couldn't tell which. "I'll need proof," he said finally. Grace nodded. "I expected that. Give me a way to contact you and I'll show you proof tomorrow." Richard wrote his private number on a napkin. Then he took out $500 in cash and slid it across the table. "Get yourself a hotel room tonight. Be ready to convince me tomorrow." Grace took the money and the napkin carefully. "I'll be ready, Mr. Blackwell. By this time tomorrow you'll believe me." As Richard watched her leave the coffee shop, he wondered if he was being foolish. But for the first time in 2 years, he felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. Richard barely slept that night. He kept thinking about the strange young woman named Grace. Was she telling the truth? Could she really help Andrew walk again? Or was she just a clever con artist who had researched his family to trick him out of money? In the morning, Richard called his head of security, a former police officer named Steve. "I need you to find information on someone, a researcher named Grace who worked at Barrett University about 3 years ago. She was studying spinal cord regeneration." While Steve worked on that, Richard went to check on Andrew. His son was already awake, sitting in his wheelchair by the window in his room. Andrew's bedroom was large and had been changed to make it easy for him to move around. The bed was special, designed to help him get in and out of his wheelchair. The bathroom had been rebuilt with rails and a shower he could roll into. "Morning, Dad," Andrew said, looking up from his tablet. At 17, Andrew looked a lot like his mother, the same brown eyes and serious expression. Before the accident, he had been tall and athletic. Now his legs seemed thin under his sweatpants. "How did you sleep?" Richard asked. The same question he asked every morning. "Same as always," Andrew answered with a small shrug. He didn't complain much, which sometimes made Richard feel even worse. "How about you? You look tired." Richard sat down on the edge of the bed. "I met someone unusual last night." He told Andrew about Grace, watching his son's face carefully. He didn't want to give Andrew false hope, but he also wanted to see what his son thought about the strange meeting. Andrew was quiet for a minute after Richard finished the story. "Do you believe her?" he finally asked. "I don't know," Richard admitted. "That's why I asked Steve to check her out. But you want to believe her, Andrew said. It wasn't a question. Richard nodded slowly. I guess I do. Me too, Andrew said quietly. Richard's phone rang. It was Steve calling back already, which was surprising. Usually background checks took longer. You're not going to believe this, Steve said without saying hello first. Grace Winters was real. She was some kind of genius at Barrett, published papers on nerve regeneration when she was just 19. But she disappeared 3 years ago after her research was shut down. The official record says she had a mental breakdown. Do you believe that? Richard asked. There was a pause. No, Steve said finally. There's something strange about the whole thing. Her work was funded by a group I've never heard of, and all her research papers were removed from the university system. It's like someone tried to erase her. Just as Richard was about to ask another question, his private phone, the one whose number he had given to Grace, started ringing. He quickly ended the call with Steve and answered it. Mr. Blackwell, Grace's voice was clear and direct. Are you ready to see proof? 2 hours later, Richard sat in another coffee shop, this one near the city park. Grace looked different today. She had washed her hair, which was actually a light brown, not blonde as he had thought last night. She was wearing clean jeans and a simple blue sweater that looked new. The $500 had been put to good use, it seemed. On the table, between them was a small metal case that looked like it might hold jewelry. Before I show you this, Grace said, I need to know if you've looked into who I am. Richard nodded. Grace Winters, child genius, started college at 15, published your first paper on nerve regeneration at 19, disappeared 3 years ago. Grace smiled slightly. Good. That saves time. She opened the metal case. Inside was a small glass vial filled with clear liquid and what looked like a modified smartphone with additional parts attached to it. This is a sample of the compound my body produces, she said, pointing to the vial. And this device controls how it's used. It sends specific electrical signals that activate the compound and direct the regeneration process. You said you tested it on yourself, Richard said. Show me. Grace rolled up the sleeve of her sweater. There were several small scars on her arm, just as she had shown him last night. But now she also pointed to a long, jagged scar that ran from her elbow to her wrist. When I was 10, I fell through a glass door. The nerves in my left arm were badly damaged. I couldn't feel anything with these 2 fingers. She wiggled her pinky and ring finger. And I had constant pain. Now I have full feeling and no pain. Richard frowned. That's not exactly proof. You could have made up the story about your fingers. I expected you to say that, Grace said calmly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small plastic container. Inside was what looked like a small white mouse. The mouse wasn't moving much, and Richard could see that its back legs were dragging. This mouse has a spinal cord injury, Grace explained. I'll show you how my treatment works. For the next 30 minutes, Richard watched as Grace carefully injected a tiny amount of the clear liquid into the mouse, then used her device to send signals to the specific area. She explained each step in scientific terms that Richard didn't fully understand. Now we wait, she said, putting the mouse back in its container. In about 4 hours, it will start to move its back legs again. In 24 hours, it will be walking normally. And you think you can do the same for Andrew? Richard asked. Yes, but it will take much longer. This mouse has a fresh injury. Andrew's is 2 years old. And human spinal cords are much more complex. Grace looked directly at Richard. It would take months of treatment, not hours. If this really works, why didn't the university support your research? Richard asked the question that had been bothering him. Grace's face darkened. Because my method doesn't just heal nerves. With modifications, it could enhance them, make them better than normal. Some people were afraid of what that could mean. Other people wanted to control it, use it for military purposes. She leaned forward. I just want to help people heal. Richard studied her face. She seemed sincere, but he had been fooled by people before. I need to see the mouse walk, he said finally. Grace nodded. Of course. We'll meet again tonight. You'll You'll see the difference." She paused. "But there's something else you need to know. If we go forward with this, I'll need to stay somewhere safe. The people who shut down my research are still looking for me." "Who are these people?" Richard asked. "A government agency called Project Horizon," Grace said quietly. "They funded my early research through the university. When they realized what I had discovered, they tried to take control of it. When I refused, they destroyed my reputation and my work." "And you've been hiding ever since?" Richard asked. Grace's eyes were steady. "I've been surviving and improving my method. But I can't keep going alone. I need resources, equipment. I need your help, Mr. Blackwell." Richard thought about Andrew, sitting in his wheelchair looking out the window. He thought about all the failed treatments and broken promises of the past 2 years. "If the mouse walks tonight," he said slowly, "we'll talk about next steps." Grace smiled for the first time since they had met. "It will walk, and soon your son will too." That evening, Richard met Grace at the same coffee shop. His heart was beating fast as she placed the small container with the mouse on the table. Richard leaned forward to look. The change was amazing. The mouse that had been barely moving its back legs that morning was now running around the container normally. It climbed up the sides and sniffed at the air holes in the top. There was no sign that it had ever been injured. "This is..." Richard couldn't find the right words. "This is what I can do for your son," Grace said quietly. "It will take longer, and it will be harder. But the process is the same." Richard watched the mouse for another minute. Then he made his decision. "Come with me," he said, standing up. "Where are we going?" Grace asked, picking up the container and her backpack. "To meet Andrew." 30 minutes later, Richard's driver pulled up to the large gates of the Blackwell home. Grace looked out the window at the big house with wide eyes. "You live here?" she asked. "It's more space than we need," Richard admitted. "But after Andrew's accident, we needed a house that could be made easier for him to move around in." They found Andrew in the large room that Richard had turned into a home gym after the accident. Andrew was working with his physical therapist, a friendly man named Joe who came 3 times a week. Andrew was using special equipment to strengthen his upper body. "That's enough for today, I think," Richard said from the doorway. Joe looked up in surprise. Richard didn't usually interrupt the sessions. "We were just finishing up anyway," he said. He helped Andrew back into his wheelchair and said goodbye. "Dad?" Andrew looked curiously at Grace. "Is this the person you told me about this morning?" Richard nodded. "Andrew, this is Grace Winters. Grace, this is my son, Andrew." Grace stepped forward. "It's nice to meet you, Andrew. Your father has told me about your injury." Andrew's face showed a mix of hope and doubt. "Dad says you think you can help me walk again. Is that true?" Grace sat down on a bench so she was at eye level with Andrew. "Yes, I believe I can. I've developed a treatment that can regenerate damaged nerves, including spinal cord injuries like yours." Andrew had heard similar claims before from doctors around the world. "What makes your treatment different?" he asked. Instead of answering, right away Grace opened her backpack and took out the container with the mouse. She told Andrew about the mouse's injury and showed him how well it was moving now. "This is after just one treatment, less than 12 hours ago," she explained. "Your injury is older and more complex. It would take months of treatment and it would be painful at times, but I believe you could regain full use of your legs." Andrew stared at the mouse, then looked up at Grace. "I've been told before that some treatment might work." "They never did," Grace nodded. "I understand why you're doubtful, but I'm not offering a treatment that might work. I'm offering one that I know will work, because I understand exactly how it functions at a cellular level." She rolled up her sleeve to show Andrew the scars on her arm and told him the same story she had told Richard. Richard watched as his son and Grace talked. They moved from basic questions about the treatment to a complex discussion about nerve cells and regeneration. Richard was surprised by how much Andrew understood. "You know a lot about biology," Grace said, sounding impressed. "I've been reading," Everything I can about spinal cord injuries since my accident, Andrew explained. I was thinking about studying medicine before. He gestured at his wheelchair. You still could, Grace said. For the first time in years, Richard saw a spark of real excitement in his son's eyes. After talking for another hour, Andrew looked at his father. I think we should try it, Dad. Richard nodded slowly. If you're sure. I'm sure, Andrew said firmly. Then we need to get set up, Richard said, turning to Grace. You'll need a lab, equipment, security, and you'll need a place to stay where you're safe from this Project Horizon you mentioned. You believe me about them? Grace asked. Steve found some interesting things when he looked into your background, Richard explained. Records that were erased, papers that disappeared. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make your work vanish. That makes me think you're telling the truth. Richard had made his decision. He would convert the east wing of the house into a lab for Grace. The wing had a separate entrance and could be secured. There were several unused bedrooms where Grace could stay. How quickly can we start? Andrew asked. I'll need about a week to set up the lab properly, Grace said. And I'll need to create more of the compound. But once we're ready, we can begin treatment right away. What do you need from me? Richard asked. Grace took a deep breath. Money, obviously, for equipment and supplies. Security to keep Project Horizon from finding me, and... She hesitated. Legal protection. What I'm doing isn't exactly approved by the medical authorities. Richard thought about this. What Grace was suggesting was risky in many ways. If something went wrong, he could be held responsible for allowing an unapproved medical treatment. But looking at Andrew's face, he knew the risk was worth taking. I'll have my lawyers draw up papers, he said, and I'll contact some people I know who can provide security. Former military, very discreet. Thank you, Grace said simply. That night, after Grace had been shown to a room in the East Wing, Richard sat with Andrew in the main living room. You really think she can do it, Dad? Andrew asked. He was trying not to sound too hopeful, but Richard could hear the excitement in his voice. I think there's a good chance, Richard said carefully. But even if it doesn't work exactly as she hopes, her research is still valuable. It could help a lot of people eventually. Andrew nodded. I like her. She doesn't talk to me like I'm broken. And she really knows her stuff. Some of the things she was saying about neural regeneration, I've never read anything like that in the medical journals. She's either brilliant or a very convincing fraud, Richard agreed. I'm betting on brilliant. Me too, Andrew said with a small smile. Over the next week, the east wing of the Blackwell house was transformed. Expensive equipment was delivered at all hours. A security team, led by a serious man named Frank, set up a perimeter around the property. Richard's lawyer visited several times with documents for Grace to sign. And through it all, Andrew waited, trying not to count the days too obviously. For the first time in 2 years, he allowed himself to hope. 1 week later, the lab was ready. Grace had turned the east wing of the Blackwell house into a state-of-the-art medical facility. There were machines that Richard had never seen before, some of them standard hospital equipment, others modified by Grace herself. Today we start, Grace said. She had changed in the past week. With proper food and rest, her face had filled out. She looked healthier, stronger. She had cut her hair short for practicality, and she wore a lab coat over her clothes. Andrew was sitting in his wheelchair in the center of the main lab room. He looked nervous but determined. Will it hurt? He asked. It was a simple question, but Richard could hear the fear behind it. Grace nodded. Yes, it will. I won't lie to you about that. The treatment involves injections directly into your spine, and as the nerves begin to regenerate, you'll feel sensations that may be uncomfortable or painful. Andrew took a deep breath. I can handle it. I know you can, Grace said with a small smile. And I'll be monitoring you constantly to make sure the pain doesn't become too much. Richard stood to the side, watching as Grace prepared the first injection. The clear liquid in the syringe looked so ordinary. It was hard to believe it could change his son's life. What exactly is in that? He asked. A compound my body produces naturally, Grace explained as she worked. I modified my own, DNA years ago as part of my research. Now my body creates proteins that can repair nerve damage. I extract the compound from my blood. Richard looked concerned. Isn't that dangerous for you? Grace shrugged. I make sure to eat well and rest between extractions. It's worth it for what the compound can do. She asked Andrew to lie face down on a special treatment table. With careful hands, she found the exact spot on his spine where the injection needed to go. Ready? She asked. Andrew nodded, his face pressed against the padded table. Ready. The first injection went in smoothly. Andrew flinched but didn't cry out. Grace then connected small electrodes to his back, around the injection site. The electrical signals helped direct the compound to the right areas, she explained. To Richard. They tell the proteins where to go and what to repair. For the next hour, Grace monitored Andrew as the compound began to work. She watched the screens of her equipment, checking readings and making small adjustments to the electrical signals. How do you feel? She asked Andrew when the hour was up. The same, he admitted, sounding disappointed. That's normal, Grace assured him. You won't feel any change for at least a month. The first phase is all about preparing the damaged area for regeneration. That became the new routine at the Blackwell house. Every morning, Andrew would go to the lab for treatment. The injections continued, sometimes twice a day. Grace monitored everything carefully, taking blood samples from Andrew and checking his progress with special scans. The first month was the hardest. Andrew didn't feel any different, and the treatments were uncomfortable. Sometimes he would get frustrated, wondering if anything was really happening. Be patient, Grace told him. Your body is changing even if you can't feel it yet. Richard watched his son closely during this time. He worried that Andrew would lose hope if the treatment didn't show results soon. But to his surprise, Andrew and Grace had developed a friendship that seemed to keep Andrew's spirits up. When Andrew wasn't receiving treatment, he would sit in the lab and talk with Grace about her research. She taught him about nerve cells and how they communicate. Andrew was a quick learner, and soon he was helping Grace analyze his own test results. You have a natural talent for this, Grace told him one day as they looked at a scan of his spine, together. Andrew smiled. Maybe I'll go to medical school after all once I can walk again. At the end of the first month, Grace performed a special scan of Andrew's spine. Look here, she said, pointing to an area on the screen. See this section? The nerve tissue is starting to regenerate. It's working just as I expected. Richard leaned in to look. He couldn't really understand what he was seeing, but the excitement in Grace's voice was clear. When will he feel something? He asked. Soon, Grace said. The second month is when the real changes begin. She was right. 10 days into the second month, Andrew was in the middle of a treatment when he suddenly gasped. What is it? Grace asked quickly, concerned that something was wrong. I felt something, Andrew said, his voice shaking. In my legs, like pins and needles. Grace broke into a wide smile. That's exactly what should happen. The nerves are reconnecting. They're sending signals again. Richard, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward. Is he really feeling his legs? Yes, Grace confirmed. It will be uncomfortable at first, like when your foot falls asleep and then wakes up. But it means the treatment is working. Over. The next few weeks, the feelings in Andrew's legs got stronger. Sometimes it was painful and he had trouble sleeping. Grace adjusted the treatment to help manage the pain, but she explained that some discomfort was necessary. The nerves are learning how to work again, she told Andrew during a particularly bad day. Think of it like physical therapy, but happening inside your body. By the middle of the third month, Andrew could feel most of his legs. He still couldn't move them, but he could feel touch, temperature, and pressure. When will he be able to move them? Richard asked during one of his daily meetings with Grace. Movement is more complex than feeling, she explained. The motor, nerves take longer to regenerate properly, but I expect some movement to begin in the next few weeks. There were other changes, too. Andrew had more energy. He was sleeping better, despite the occasional pain. He spent more time in the gym, working with Joe, the physical therapist, to strengthen his upper body in preparation for when he could use his legs again. But not everything was going well. Frank, the head of security, reported strange cars driving past the property too often to be a coincidence. Someone had tried to hack into Richard's company computers, and Grace was becoming more anxious, checking the security cameras several times a day. "Are you worried about Project Horizon?" Richard asked her one evening after Andrew had gone to bed. Grace nodded. "They have resources we can't imagine, and if they find out what we're doing here, they'll try to stop us." "Why?" Richard asked. "Why would anyone want to stop something that could help so many people?" Grace's face was serious. "Because they don't want to help people. They want to control the technology, use it for their own purposes. If a treatment like mine becomes widely known, they lose that control." Richard put his hand on her shoulder. "We won't let that happen. My security team is the best, and soon Andrew will be walking again. Then we can decide how to share your discovery with the world." Grace gave him a small smile, but her eyes remained worried. "I hope you're right." It happened on a Tuesday morning, 4 months after the treatment began. Andrew was in the gym with Joe doing his usual exercises. Grace was working in the lab, and Richard was on a video call in his office. "Try to focus on your right leg," Joe said. "Just think about moving your toe." Andrew had been trying this exercise for weeks with no success, but this time when he focused his mind on his right big toe, it moved. Just a small twitch, but it moved. "Joe!" Andrew shouted. "Did you see that?" Joe looked down at Andrew's foot, and his eyes widened. "Do it again," he said quietly. Andrew concentrated, and again his toe moved. "Grace," Joe called out, his voice echoing down the hallway. "Grace, come quick." Grace ran into the gym, thinking something was wrong. Richard heard the commotion and ended his call abruptly. "What's happening?" Grace asked as she entered the room. Andrew was crying, but they were tears of joy. "I moved my toe," he said. "I really moved it." Grace knelt down and put her hand on Andrew's foot. "Show me," she said. Again Andrew concentrated, and his toe moved under Grace's touch. She broke into a huge smile. "This is amazing. It's happening even faster than I expected." Richard arrived out of breath from running. "What's going on?" "Dad, look." Andrew moved his toe again. Richard stared, then sank into a nearby chair. After 2 years of his son being unable to move his legs, this small movement seemed like a miracle. Over the next week, Andrew gained more control. First just the toe, then his entire foot. By the end of the week, he could move both feet. "The nerves are reconnecting properly," Grace explained during one of her scans. "Once the process starts, it moves much faster." 2 weeks later, Andrew was able to move his legs from the knees down. The movements were weak and shaky, but they were real. Grace adjusted the treatment schedule, focusing now on building strength in the regenerated nerves. "When will he be able to stand?" Richard asked one evening. "Soon," Grace said. "But we need to be careful. His bones and muscles have weakened from not being used. We need to strengthen them before he tries to bear weight." Andrew worked harder than ever in the gym. Joe developed new exercises to help build up his leg muscles. Even when it was painful, Andrew pushed himself. "I'm going to walk again," he told his father one night. "I can feel it." Richard believed him. After seeing his son move his legs, he had no more doubts about Grace's treatment. But as Andrew's progress continued, the threat from outside grew stronger. Frank reported that someone had tried to break through the property's security system. The attempt had failed, but it was clear that they were running out of time. "Project Horizon is closing in," Grace told Richard. "They know I'm here." "How could they know?" Richard asked. "They probably tracked the equipment we purchased," Grace said. "Or they've been monitoring your company's activities." Richard called an emergency meeting with Frank and his security team. "We need to be ready," he told them. "If they try to get in, we need to stop them." Frank nodded. "My men are prepared. But Mr. Blackwell, these aren't ordinary criminals. If this is really a government operation, they have resources we can't match. What do you suggest? Richard asked. We need to move, Frank said. Take the boy and Dr. Winters to a safer location. I have a few ideas where we could go. But before they could make plans, Andrew had a breakthrough. It was early morning and he was in the lab with Grace. She had been helping him stand between parallel bars, supporting most of his weight with his arms. Let me try something, Andrew said. Slowly, he loosened his grip on the bars. He wobbled but remained upright, supporting more of his weight on his legs than ever before. Take it easy, Grace cautioned. Don't push too hard. But Andrew had determination in his eyes. He loosened his grip a little more, then a little more, and then for a brief moment he was standing on his own. He managed 5 seconds before his legs trembled and gave out. Grace caught him and helped him back into his wheelchair. That was amazing, she said, but also dangerous. We need to build up to that slowly. Andrew was too excited to be cautious. I stood, Grace, I really stood. Richard, who had been watching from the doorway, came in with tears in his eyes. I'm so proud of you, he told his son. That evening, as they celebrated Andrew's progress, the alarm system went off. Frank's voice came through the intercom system. We have intruders on the property, he said. Armed men approaching from the north side. Everyone get to the safe room now. Richard had prepared for this. There was a reinforced room in the center of the house, designed to protect them in case of an attack. He quickly wheeled Andrew toward it, with Grace running alongside. We need to get the research, Grace said, turning toward the lab. No time, Richard said. Your safety is more important. But if they get the formula, everything we've done will be for nothing, Grace argued. Before Richard could respond, the sound of gunfire erupted outside. Frank and his men were engaging the intruders. Dad, she's right, Andrew said. We can't let them take her work. Richard hesitated, then nodded. Grace, get what you need. We'll meet you at the safe room. Be quick. Grace ran to the lab while Richard continued toward the safe room with Andrew. They had just reached it when the power went out. The emergency lights came on, casting an eerie glow. Where's Grace? Andrew asked as minutes passed. Richard was about to go look for her when the door opened. Grace rushed in, clutching a small metal case and a computer drive. I got everything, she said, breathing hard. All my research, the formula, everything. They sealed the door just as they heard footsteps in the hallway outside. The safe room had its own power and air supply. They could stay there for days, if necessary. What now? Andrew asked. Richard had been thinking about this moment. Now we end this. Grace, you said they want to control your discovery. Keep it secret? Grace nodded. That's why they're after me. Then we take away their power, Richard said. We make your discovery public, share it with the world. But how? Grace asked. We're trapped here. Richard smiled and pointed to a computer in the corner. That has a secure satellite connection. We can upload your research to servers around the world. Once it's public, Project Horizon has no reason to come after you. Grace looked uncertain. My work isn't finished. There are still improvements to be made, tests to run. But it works, Andrew said. Look at me. I stood today. That's proof enough. Grace thought for a moment, then nodded. You're right. Let's do it. While they could hear the sounds of fighting outside, Grace and Richard worked together to upload all of her research, including videos of Andrew's progress, to medical servers around the world. They sent copies to major universities, research hospitals, and news organizations. It's done, Richard said finally. Your work belongs to the world now. 3 hours later, Frank's voice came through the intercom. It's safe to come out, Mr. Blackwell. They're gone. When they emerged, they found that the intruders had fled. News of Grace's breakthrough was already spreading across the internet. By making the discovery public, Richard had taken away Project Horizon's reason for silencing Grace. 2 months later, Andrew took his first unassisted steps across the living room. Grace stood nearby, ready to catch him if he fell, but he didn't need her help. Richard watched with tears in his eyes as his son walked toward him, step by careful step. The treatments would continue for several more months, but there was no doubt now that Andrew would fully recover. "Thank you," Richard said to Grace as Andrew reached him and they embraced. "For everything." Grace smiled. "This is just the beginning. Hospitals around the world are already using my treatment. Thousands of people like Andrew will walk again." Andrew turned to look at her. "All because a homeless girl said, 'Sir, I can make your son walk again.'"